The BBC has come under widespread criticism for its reporting on Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. Of course, the criticisms focus on the systematic failures in its coverage. Now, a lot of those critiques obviously come from outside the BBC, but it should be noted that there is massive discontent within the BBC. How do we know that? Well, for a start, there was a letter signed by around 100 BBC journalists, staff, condemning the BBC over its failures in that reporting. Now, interestingly enough, I'm joined by the former BBC newsreader who was responsible for writing, getting that letter together, which was then obviously signed by so many of her former colleagues. She has now quit the BBC, and I'm very glad to be speaking to Karishma Patel, who knows very much what's going on at the BBC behind the scenes. There are those who can speak in terms of, you know, what we can see, what we can read, what we can hear. But Karishma has the behind the scenes take and has worked on this issue for a very long time. Karishma, it's great to speak to you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm getting a lot of attention, obviously, after my piece in The Independent. These are all things that I've wanted to say for a long time. So it's nice now to be able to start conversations around what we should be expecting from our public broadcaster.
Yeah, it's a crucial conversation. You've definitely made a massive contribution there already. Let's just start. Why did you quit the BBC?
So I essentially quit the BBC over its unwillingness to follow the evidence coming out of Gaza. That, at its heart, was my problem. Now, I'm a journalist. My job is to follow the evidence to its conclusions, to its robust conclusions. And, you know, it doesn't matter to me who that angers. Now, every day I was working on Gaza, I was seeing some of the worst things I will ever see in my life. And, you know, I'm sure that's the same for you. That's the same for a lot of people, in fact, you know, much of the public. And I was very quickly coming to those robust conclusions. You know, Israel was committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, targeting civilians, including children, including doctors, teachers. And I could see that in front of my eyes. And it wasn't just me, you know, there are multiple aid organizations that the BBC have relied upon heavily in the past who were saying the same thing. And, you know, they had aid workers in Gaza, a place that the BBC didn't even have access to. So like I said, very quickly, I was coming to these conclusions, and I turned around and looked at my organization and found that it wasn't, or that it was refusing to, or that it was afraid to essentially come to these conclusions. You know, to the extent that we were seeing Israeli officials being interviewed by presenters, by correspondents, claiming that, you know, Israel is doing everything it can to keep civilians safe, and correspondents and presenters were not responding to that with, you know, with the evidence, but were instead allowing claims like this to be made with no pushback. And I was seeing that incredibly regularly. So for me, yeah, go on.
Well, okay, so I'll give you a classic. This is the response that you and I will get on this. The BBC will go, we get criticised by those who are pro-Israel, we get criticised by people who are pro-Palestinian. Therefore, it shows in a difficult situation, we're getting the balance right. When you hear that critique, what do you say?
I mean, it's an incredibly worn out critique. It isn't the case that because everybody is annoyed at you, you are doing your job well. Doing your job well as a journalist is about editorial consistency. It's about how consistent the BBC is being with its own editorial policies. And in terms of all of its coverage of Gaza, but also, you know, the occupied West Bank, that has not been the case. So yes, it turns around and talks about essentially treating its journalism as entirely publicly perceived. There are internal policies, and we're meant to be consistent with them. So frankly, every time Tim Davie says that, it's a massive cop-out, and the public shouldn't be accepting that as a response.
And I should say, in my piece of the BBC, I worked with two data journalists who actually examined the statistical evidence and showed that the online reporting was overwhelmingly weighted in terms of giving massive far more weight, for example, to Israelis being killed than to Palestinians being killed, and so on and so forth. So there's actual statistical evidence. Just in terms of, let's just talk about some specifics. You, in your article in The Independent, which you wrote following the leaving the BBC, you talked about the case of Hind Rajab, who was a 5-year-old girl. She was killed with her 4 cousins, her aunt, her uncle, who were fleeing Gaza City after a order to flee by the Israeli army. And the phone call of her 15-year-old cousin was to Palestine Red Crescent was, that was broadcast that you heard her being killed by an Israeli tank on that call. And then Hind Rajab was left with her family killed in that car. And she made a desperate call, terrified, to the Red Crescent. The paramedics said to save them, to save her, were then, after coordinating their movements with the IDF, were killed as well. Can you just tell me what happened when you pitched this horrible story at the beginning?
Yeah, so my job was to look through everything before going to my morning pitch meeting. So it was to pour through social media, to look at what Arab media was reporting, to see what aid organizations were saying, and then to turn up to my morning pitch meeting with a selection of stories we could cover. And that's essentially what I was doing for months on end. And at the end of January in 2024, I saw that the Red Crescent was tweeting updates about a girl trapped in a car, murdered relatives around her, relatives the Israeli military had murdered. And immediately I understood that this was a critically important story to cover. Immediately. I mean, she's a young girl. And I also understood that if she was Ukrainian, she was American, we would be seeing wall-to-wall coverage. So I did my job and I pitched her story. And I said, look, the Red Crescent are tweeting these updates. They're gaining a lot of traction. This is a massive story. But also, Hind deserved wall-to-wall coverage. Her life matters. I shouldn't have had to convince anyone of that. As I said, if we were talking about a Ukrainian girl, I'm sure that my teams across the BBC would have jumped on this story. We'd have been seeing immediately photos, lots of interviews with the Red Crescent, constant updates on the rescue process. But we'd also have been seeing a sort of language of accountability around the coverage, as in people would have been asking, let's say if it was in Ukraine, they'd have been asking Russia what has happened to her. Now, that's not what we saw. And, there may be people who say that there were smaller instances where it was mentioned. As far as I'm aware, the most significant coverage came around the 5th of February, and there was an article on the website.
That was quite a long time after she was killed.
Yeah.
The bodies were then subsequently found, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember pitching her story at the end of January. So we are talking about days. We are talking about days in which Arab media was covering her story. Mm-hmm. There are Al Jazeera reports from the end of January.
Mm-hmm. That's when she was killed, the 29th of January. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this speaks to a kind of newsroom culture, or a culture across the BBC, mm-hmm. in which there's an unwillingness to touch stories where Israel looks bad, where it's very clear that Israel has committed a war crime or a crime against humanity. But there is also racism at the heart of this. Certain lives are treated as if they matter more. And I think there's a whole broader conversation to be had around how the media actually schools audiences to empathize with certain groups, and to care far less about other groups. Empathetic coverage. And this is one of the things I sort of want to empower the public with, because I think people recognize when they're seeing dehumanizing coverage, but they don't quite know which mechanisms are at work. But coverage that is schooling the audience to empathize will involve photos, individual names, interviews with family members. We may even see someone's childhood bedroom. We'll get a sense of their dreams, who they were as a person if they've been killed. And press conferences as well, parents crying over podiums. These are all methods of teaching people to care. Now that entire suite of methods was actually just reserved for Israelis for months and months and months after October 2023. Now that's teaching the public a very specific lesson. And it's saying Israeli grief is exceptional, and it justifies an exceptional extrajudicial response. And that is what we have been seeing.
You can see that, can't you, with the lack of follow-up, for example, with Hind Rajab, because a detailed study by experts at Goldsmith University with forensic architecture did a detailed study into how she was killed, and they found well over 300 bullets in the car, that it was the tank was only a few meters away, it was broad daylight. How could they conceivably not have been aware who was in that car? And there was if that we know, for example, the horrible fate of the Bibas family, that there would be a constant look to see what has actually happened and a focus on what's happened, and that's something which becomes a live issue. But that's not what happened with Hind Rajab. It was eventually reported on, but in a way which is kind of in the fog of war. Who is to know what has really happened? Israel says this, when actually the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction. But the BBC never got around to doing that, and that you can see the double standard there, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an entire verification team. It is very much their job to do work like that. And there is good work that they have done. But I'm talking about a sort of newsroom culture of fear that's set in, that means certain stories don't get covered, or journalists are choosing the path of least resistance in order to avoid, mass complaints, or to avoid getting told off by certain editors or executives. These aren't conditions under which good journalism happens.
Self-censorship.
Self-censorship, exactly. Yeah, it's very, it's very control society. Because I think when you look at the kinds of stories that haven't been covered, it paints a very clear picture of what the BBC is afraid of talking about. Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, you can see, I guess, at one point, which many would raise is, for example, looking at the 7th of October and war crimes committed there, the BBC would frame that as subjective, and the words used like massacre, for example, but that would never be applied even to circumstances when huge numbers of civilians, like over 100 in one go, over 100 civilians just exterminated. And the fact we mentioned Hind Rajab, most of those killed have been women and children. Obviously, there were innocent men as well. But that itself is indicative of the scale of a crime being committed. But that isn't, so where the BBC will objectively look at 7th of October and treat it as criminal, as a massacre, you don't get this. That's not, even with any of these incidents, so many of them, there's thousands of them, but none of them have that treatment.
No, absolutely. We haven't seen parity in how Israeli deaths and Palestinian deaths rather Palestinians being killed by Israel, are covered. But I would essentially say that there is an accountability hole at the heart of the BBC's Gaza coverage. And, you were talking about the word massacre there. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting. I would argue that an entire language was constructed to put distance between Israel and its actions. And it's a language devoid of accountability. There are lots of instances of this that I think people have picked up on across the past 15, 16 months. Palestinians have died while, Israelis are killed by certain accountable actors. Palestinians allege things, they allege that they've experienced torture in Israeli jails while Israelis tell of things. Right there, one group is deemed more trustworthy as a source than another. And there are all of these instances of language being used to sort of remove clarity from the reporting, which is the opposite of what we're meant to be doing. And it's the case with the phrase Hamas-run health ministry as well. It's casting doubt on figures that, before October 2023 were relied on by all of the major aid agencies operating there. And as far as I'm aware, I think by Israel itself at different points. So once again, it removes clarity from our reporting. And there's no real way to justify doing that. I mean, another instance of this is, presenters like a sort of reflex talking about Israel's right to self-defense, which is it's a legally incoherent claim, and there's no explanation around that.
So people are aware, it's because Gaza isn't a state. It's classified under international law as occupied territory prior to 7th of October. So self-defense doesn't apply to because it's not two states. Yeah, legally speaking.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. This is the thing. This is an explanation that you will never have heard on the BBC, and you've just done it. You've just done it very clearly, very easily. And there's no reason that a presenter can't say, well, Israel would say it has a right to self-defense, but XYZ, or legal experts say XYZ. These aren't difficult things to incorporate into coverage.
Because, for example, no presenter would ever dream of saying about 7th of October, because under international law, you obviously cannot commit war crimes or crimes against humanity. Palestinians have a right to self-defense, but no presenter would make that case, because they would go, well, clearly these war crimes were committed, therefore. But in the same applies, is they can't, with the Israeli state, they wouldn't apply the same, which is, well, obviously they're committing war crimes, and that negates any claim to self-defense in any case. The same logic isn't applied.
No, 100%. The same logic isn't applied. And I mean, you can also see it in terms of how presenters have reacted to the word genocide when it's said by guests. You may have a Palestinian guest or an analyst talking about the word genocide, which has a very specific legal meaning, and you've got presenters just balking at it, panicking, and then just calling it controversial, calling it emotional, and not reasonably engaging with the term at all. And once again, that's another big accountability gap in our coverage. I'm not saying that the BBC has to use the word genocide. I'm saying that it, at the very least, needs to sort of not shut down discussion around it, and that it needs to actually foreground experts in this area. So
it basically is a credible claim, because so many genocide and Holocaust scholars have spoken out and said it's genocide, and there's a live case in the International the International Court of Justice. So therefore, it shouldn't be treated as outside the parameters of acceptable discourse, which is what the BBC does.
Yeah, precisely. It is that. And frankly, the ICJ ruling in January, and then the ICC arrest warrant issued against Netanyahu, both of these should have marked editorial shifts in coverage around Gaza. Absolutely. I'm very sure they would in any other case.
I mean, you mentioned Hamas-run health ministry and how that was used basically just as a rule. Again, if that was applied equally, every time Benjamin Netanyahu was mentioned, they should say, who is subject to an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, that's a fact.
Yeah. And once again, that's very easy to incorporate into coverage. So that's just editorial policy saying, look, this instance of what I'd call legal accountability has occurred. And it means that we need to see a shift in our coverage to reflect it, to reflect international law, to reflect what's happening. And then, we need a rule, an editorial rule that says, look, when you're talking about Netanyahu, when you are talking about Gaza, this line needs to be in there. This line around the ICC arrest warrant that is out for him should be in all of the coverage, because it's not the case that the BBC won't cover it once, but the fact it then forgets about it communicates to the public that it doesn't matter and that it's not necessary context.
I mean, linked to that, it's a question I often raise, which is about intent, stated intent. And when I interviewed Raz Sigal, the Israeli-American Associate Professor of Genocide and Holocaust Studies, quite near the beginning, the point he would make, it's rare for states to be so open about their intent. Normally they go to great lengths to cover it up, but that's not been the case. And one example I often bring up is there's so many genocidal and criminal statements of intent by Israeli leaders, officials, and so on. But one, for example, this is Major General Ghassan Alian, who was an Israeli general who was in charge of Kogat, the civilian arm of the Israeli army. And he said on the 9th of October, 2023, Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human beasts are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza, no electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. There's no pretense there that about collective guilt of civilians, of the intent to treat civilians, therefore, as legitimate targets, to break the law, which is what he's stated there. That's not unambiguously against the law to impose collective punishment and to cut off the means of life. That was never quoted by the BBC at the time. They just didn't quote it. And they didn't quote many statements like that, let alone frame coverage around it.
I mean, this was something raised internally. BBC staff had noticed that certain very important stories weren't being covered. And I mean this very early on, very early in 2024. So, we were a few months in. And there was no article on the website listing statements of intent from Israeli ministers, despite the fact that every single one of us covering Gaza had been noting these down, because it was part of our jobs to be across the story area every single day. And as far as we were all concerned, there were enough statements of intent to warrant, an article at the front of the website listing them, at least that.
The Telegraph did it. A pro-Israel newspaper. The Telegraph did that.
Yeah, at the very least. But this is not what happened. It was also the case that, everyone working on Gaza could see these videos on TikTok.
Of IDF, yeah.
Yeah, of Israeli, soldiers in the Israeli military filming themselves, blowing up homes, dancing, wearing women's clothes that they'd taken out of their drawers.
Toys.
And again, and again, there was no documentary. There was no investigation into this. There was not so much as an article on it. And as I've said before, the kinds of things that the BBC shied away from paint a very clear picture around what they're afraid of. And they are afraid of holding Israel accountable for very clear war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I think a really striking example is articles on famine, because the BBC, have done coverage about hunger, famine in Gaza without proper prominence, but nonetheless. But it's the failure to join the dots, because Yoav Gallant, the defense minister at the beginning, said that there would be a total siege because we're fighting human animals, as he said. Others, I've quoted one, also made clear there was a siege. Multiple aid agencies said there was a siege. The two US government departments concluded that Israel was deliberately withholding aid from Gaza. And the ICC arrest warrant centre on deliberate starvation as an act of warfare. But that is not woven in to articles which often present hunger as though you might be reading about a natural disaster.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this has been common practice since October 2023. Crucial context has been missing. Crucial context of every kind, historical, political, legal, has been conspicuously omitted from coverage, to the extent that our audiences, if they are simply relying on the BBC for good coverage of Gaza, are disinformed. I'm going to call it a form of disinformation, because these are active editorial decisions not to include the correct context. And there, there hasn't been so much as a conversation internally with all of the Middle East specialists to talk about the kind of context that would be appropriate. But at the very least, absolutely, details around the ICC arrest warrant should be in every single article.
In the article in The Independent, you wrote the following: journalists were actively choosing not to follow evidence out of fear. For months, I watched the BBC repeat one of its gravest editorial errors around climate change, debating a phenomenon long after the evidence showed it's real. We deserve a public service broadcast that follows the evidence in a timely manner without fear of favour. Editorial bravery is key. Do you just explain, what do you mean by that? And that comparison with the climate emergency?
Yeah, so I think everybody at this point accepts that the BBC should not have been debating the phenomenon of man-made climate change for as long as it did. There were plenty of climate experts, scientists telling the BBC that there is enough evidence. It should now become part of your editorial policy to say that climate change is real, man-made climate change is real. And that by refusing to do so, you are just empowering disinformation, climate change denial. And this is because the BBC has a very, very powerful sanitizing and legitimizing function. It's at the heart of British society. And if you see certain voices on Question Time, for example, enough, you will begin to think that they have a legitimate point, especially if there's not enough pushback. If you see them on the BBC News at 10 enough, on the BBC News at 1, on Radio 4, they will become part of the national conversation. And the BBC, I think, has failed to understand just how powerful a function it has. Now, in terms of Gaza, we are seeing that again, that refusal to follow evidence from experts, evidence in front of all of our eyes at this point, to its robust evidence-based conclusion, and to then work that into coverage. So as I've said, coverage should now be shaped around the fact that Israel targets civilians, commits war crimes, commits crimes against humanity. I understand that they will turn around and say that a lot of these legal processes are pending, but there are ways to responsibly incorporate things like the ICC arrest warrants. Yeah. And I don't think anyone can argue against that.
And they didn't wait for a legal process when it comes to 7th October with Hamas. We could see the war crimes are committed on 7th October. So there wasn't when something's obvious, you don't need to do that. So there's a double standard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that at this point, it should just never be the case. At this point, it should just never be the case that an Israeli representative can go on the BBC and not face sufficient pushback. Very strong pushback. These should always have been, since October, these should always have been the most robust political interviews happening on the BBC. They should not have been able to get away with making any claim. And instead, we were seeing the opposite for months and months and months. And, the damage has been done. I'm wondering if the BBC can learn from it. As far as I can tell, in terms of the way the executive is acting and how they've acted around this documentary, it seems it's unwilling to learn lessons, and it's unwilling to be editorially brave, it's the only way to be a journalist under the current climate, frankly. We can't be editorially sitting on the fence or editorially cowardly. At that point, we aren't serving the function of journalists. Right now, journalists are under attack in every possible way. So, go on.
On that, just before I ask finally, just in terms of, kind of what next, I guess. As an example, the BBC rightly will not treat official claims by Russian authorities about the invasion of Ukraine as credible or statements they should defer to. They might quote them, but they'll put them in context. And I mean, that's the problem with a huge amount of BBC coverage is even when they report on terrible atrocities being committed by the Israeli state, the IDF response is foregrounded, not challenged, and often the story's framed around it. I mean, that's happened repeatedly. And that's the problem, as you can see there, even though we know as a fact, just an objective fact, that IDF statements have been proven over and over and over again to be completely and utterly false. And actually some, even media outlets which people have criticized for failing over this, have exposed false claims. Even the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post have done this. So that's another problem, is that they're still treated as though they're credible, because the BBC treats Israel basically as another democratic state. It might have flaws, but it doesn't apply the same to Russia.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Israel has been consistently treated as a reliable source on no sound basis whatsoever. I mean, there are at this point countless examples of Israel acting as a bad source, and they predate October 2023. I mean, we can talk about Shireen Abu Akleh, for example. And, the evidence is already there that Israel is not a good source of information. And as a journalist, you can operate under that assumption. You should be, generally speaking, operating under that assumption anyway. And then it's the BBC's job to report on Gaza and report on Israel's claims, but as you've said, situate them within the correct context and make the public aware of just how reliable a source this is. Because most people are coming to the BBC for a minute or two at a time, frankly. They are switching the television on just to get a glimpse of what the news is, or they are looking at an article for maybe 10 seconds.
Or for just a headline.
And there are plenty of studies to attest to the fact that a lot of people just look at the headline. And the BBC needs to think very carefully about what people are then coming away with. And when entire articles are framed around Israel's right of reply, that forms a it's basically serving a very legitimizing function.
I mean, you said in the piece, I'm about to make a bold claim, truth exists. And you've referred to this old saying, which you add an important kind of send off to it. As the old saying goes, the journalist's job isn't to report that it may or may not be raining. It's to look outside and tell the public if it is. And let me tell you, there's a storm.
Yeah, and I mean, that part of the article has been resonating with people most, because journalists right now are operating in an impossible landscape. There are, hundreds and hundreds of competing claims at any given moment on social media. There are bots. There are, there are AI accounts coming out with all sorts of things. And if a journalist basically can't wade through that, find the evidence and come to some sort of conclusion, then all it's doing is feeding into the confusion. At best, it's feeding into the confusion. Now, for the BBC, with its strong legitimizing function, legitimizes constant debate of a story around a story area as serious as Gaza. It is telling the public that everything, it is telling the public that war crimes and crimes against humanity are essentially debatable. And that's not the case. And I think the BBC needs to think very carefully about the function it wants to serve in a society where, the far right is on the rise, racism is on the rise, international law has effectively been torn up. What function does the BBC want to serve in that landscape? And I don't think it has an answer to that.
What's the response been from your former BBC colleagues about you speaking out about the BBC's editorial failings on Israel's genocide in Gaza?
I've actually had overwhelming support from people within the BBC. I've had plenty of people get in touch to say, thank you for writing what I wish I could write. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for voicing what so many of us think. I mean, there are a lot of good people within the BBC and within a lot of these news organizations, and they have come to somewhere like the BBC not out of an urge to make money, because frankly you're not likely to, but they've come out of an urge to do public service journalism. And for plenty of them, coverage of Gaza has shown them that, you know, the BBC's definition of public service journalism differs quite a bit from theirs. And so there are plenty of people internally who want to say what I'm currently saying. And I think it's important the public knows that. It is the case that there are good people inside pushing good things through, which is why you will see good things sometimes. Whether or not that's enough is another question. But I think it's important that those people are still there and that there are still good people within these organizations. I sat down and thought about, you know, my skills and also what I'm able to do in terms of raising awareness around Gaza, around the media coverage of Gaza. And I came to the conclusion that speaking out was the best thing I could do. But for others, there are different ways of approaching this, and trying to do good work is one of those ways.
I want to ask you, you're a former BBC News presenter. You resigned from the BBC over its editorial failings on Israel and Gaza. You're going to take part in a beauty pageant, and I'm fascinated at this. And you're doing it partly because, or you're doing it, in fact, the reason you're doing it is because of Gaza. Can you just tell me how's this come about, and what's this all about?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have done is to sort of sit down, look myself in the mirror, and think about the different ways in which I can raise awareness around what is happening in Gaza and what Israel's done in Gaza, but yeah, also around the media coverage. Now, one of those ways is writing, and I've done that in The Independent, and I'm doing that. But the other way is actually using beauty, using pageantry, using something that's very, it's very aesthetically appealing, it's entertaining. And it's a really good way actually to get people to listen to what you're saying. And it's also a good way to talk about, humanitarian concerns. So I'm a Miss Universe Great Britain finalist. And as part of that, thank you very much. As part of that, I am supporting a charity called Gaza Great Minds, and they build schools in Gaza, and they build them in tents. And it just goes to show how far Israel has completely decimated the education system in Gaza, along with everything else. And I'm using my platform to talk about that. But I think at this stage, it's also a really important intervention to see a woman of color attempting to represent Great Britain in any sense, because I think we've regressed some decades in terms of how the national conversation is going around that. And the sort of response I got was, it was largely positive, but there was plenty of racism. There were plenty of people saying, you're a brown woman, you can't represent Great Britain, you're not indigenous to this place, things like that. But these people have been empowered by the current climate, and it is a climate in which the far right is doing very well. And I think this will also be a good opportunity to sort of intervene in that space and to talk a bit about that. So I think there are lots of functions that can be served by me doing this sort of work. But to paraphrase Walt Whitman, I contain multitudes. There are lots of things I want to do. There are lots of things I'm doing currently. And, I'm also working towards writing a book on how impartiality has failed the public, essentially. So yeah, I'm up to quite a few different things.
Great. Well, all power to you. Just finally on that. Firstly, I can't wait for your book, and the beauty pageant. You should smash it. So massive kudos on that. Just very quickly, finally. You're a former BBC newsreader who's quit the BBC over its failings. What would you say to fellow journalists who work for mainstream media outlets who feel clearly that the media has failed catastrophically in reporting overwhelmingly on this horror, but maybe they feel scared, maybe they don't know what to do? What would you say to people who are like you, who work or were like you, who work for these mainstream media outlets?
I mean, I was incredibly afraid to say anything, to do anything. And I think especially when you are within these newsrooms and you're surrounded by, this culture of fear, and you're afraid to critique the coverage even internally, I can understand why so many people are afraid. But what I would say to them is that our entire profession is at stake. The entire concept of public service journalism is at stake. That I'm saying more specifically to people at the BBC. The time to do something was months ago, but the time to do something is now, if not months ago. And by that, I mean, I'm not suggesting that everyone should leave their jobs and do what I'm doing, but there are different interventions people are able to make. And at this point, at different news organizations, people have actually fought for complaint routes and things like that. So at this point, there may be more well-worn paths to be taken to express some of this dissent. But these issues are far from gone. And you can see it more recently in terms of the language around the ceasefire deal. Hostage, prisoner, these words again are doing a lot of heavy lifting. And like I said, there's an entire language to shield Israel from accountability. These issues are still there. So our jobs are not done. So if you are within any of these news organizations, not just the BBC, but any of the major broadcasters, let's say, find the complaint routes, use them as best you can, use them, but also find other journalists and organize, because as a community, we're all much, much stronger. And I think when you're in a newsroom that's governed by this culture of fear, you can feel incredibly isolated and you can begin to gaslight yourself. Frankly, at this point, there is plenty of evidence to support everything that I'm saying. So I'm not afraid of saying it.
Incredible stuff. I think everyone watching or listening to this will be in awe of your courage, your moral clarity, and your determination to just, at the end of the day, do what a journalist should be doing when covering this sort of story. I mean, this is what this is actually really about. It's about the integrity of journalism, which is under threat, it's under assault, not least in the rather hideous moment of human history we're currently living in. So Karishma, it's been such an honor. For those watching, please do share this video, get the message out, leave comments, subscribe, leave comments, press like. That's good for the algorithm, therefore more people listen to what Karishma has to say. It's really important we get this out because this will help build pressure. The BBC is supposed to be responsive, if you're British, to you as the licence payer. They are supposed to they're failing you. They're failing you in their job to report accurately on what's actually happening, and you should put pressure on them to change that. And Karishma has helped arm us with the facts because she actually worked there and knows what's going on. So do share this video, get the message out. But Karishma, honestly, what an honor. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Yeah, thank you.